In the heart of a city that never seemed to take a breath, there was an office that buzzed like a beehive on steroids. It was a marketing firm, a place where ideas were supposed to fly around like sparks from a fire. And they did, but they were loud, flashy sparks, thrown by people who knew how to make the most noise. In the middle of all this chaos was a woman named Ilara. She didn't buzz. She didn't spark, she just was. Every morning, she would arrive at exactly 8:45 a.m., not a minute early, not a minute late. She'd slip through the glass doors, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished concrete floor. While her colleagues were already shouting greetings across the room, their laughter bouncing off the exposed brick walls, Ilara would move like a ghost to her small desk in the corner. It was a good desk, tucked away behind a large fake plant, which offered a sliver of privacy in the wide-open space. Her day began with the same ritual. She'd hang her coat on the back of her chair, place her modest handbag on the floor, and turn on her computer. While it booted up, she'd walk to the small kitchen area. More often than not, the coffee pot would be empty, sitting there like a sad, dark monument to the last person who used it. She'd clean it, scoop in the fresh grounds, fill the water, and start a new brew. She never drank coffee herself, but she knew everyone else would need it. It was just one of those things she did. No one ever said thank you. They just noticed when it wasn't there. Her official title was administrative assistant, but in reality she was the office's silent fixer. The printer would jam with a groan, and a small crowd would gather around it, poking and prodding until someone would finally say, "Where's Ilara?" She'd walk over, her calm presence a stark contrast to their frantic energy. Within a minute, she'd have a piece of paper extracted from the guts of the machine, and it would be whirring happily again. She'd get a quick, "Oh, thanks, you're a lifesaver," before they all rushed back to their desks, leaving her to clean up the shredded paper and spilled toner. In meetings, she was practically a piece of furniture. The team was led by a man named Mark, a charismatic guy whose voice seemed to be permanently set to project. He would pace around the conference table, throwing out ideas, his energy filling the room. Ilara would sit with her notepad, pen in hand, ready to contribute. She noticed things. She'd see that a campaign idea aimed at young people used slang that was 5 years out of date. She'd notice that a proposed ad for a family car didn't actually show any families, just a man driving alone on a winding road. Once, during a brainstorm for a new coffee shop, she cleared her throat. It was a small sound easily lost. "Maybe," she started, her voice softer than she intended, "we could focus on the idea of the coffee shop as a third place. Not home, not work, but a community hub. A place where people can connect." Mark, who was staring at the ceiling, didn't even look at her. He just waved a hand in her general direction. "Good thought, Ilara. We'll stick to the main strategy. We need something with more punch, you know? Something that pops." And then he turned to another colleague and said, "What about we focus on the coffee shop as a community hub? A place for people to connect?" The colleague, a man with a loud laugh, immediately jumped on it. "Yes, that's brilliant, Mark. A third place." The room erupted in agreement. Mark was a genius. Ilara just lowered her eyes and wrote down the idea in her notepad, her handwriting neat and precise. A familiar, dull ache settled in her chest. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It was more like a deep, heavy sigh that lived inside her all the time. She was used to it. She had learned a long time ago that her voice didn't carry very far in a world full of shouters. She watched her colleagues. Really watched them. She saw how the woman with the perfect manicure would subtly check her reflection in her dark computer screen every few minutes. She noticed how the young intern, always so eager to please, would get a nervous twitch in his eye when Mark raised his voice. She knew who was secretly dating whom, based on the way they lingered by each other's desks. She saw all the little human things that everyone else was too busy being loud to notice. She was the office's secret keeper, a silent vault of unspoken thoughts and observations. When 5:30 p.m. rolled around, the office didn't quiet down. It just changed its energy. People packed up, still shouting about their plans for the evening, where they were going for drinks, what show they were binging. They would file out, giving Ilara a quick, absent-minded wave on their way to the elevator. "See ya, Ilara." "Night, Ilara." The words were friendly, but empty, like saying goodbye to the office plant. She was always one of the last to leave. She would finish up her tasks, make sure the kitchen was tidy, and then gather her things. The walk home was her transition period. The noise of the city, the honking cars and chattering crowds, would slowly fade into the background as she walked through her neighborhood and up the 3 flights of stairs to her small apartment. The moment she unlocked her door and stepped inside, it was like she could finally breathe. The apartment was her sanctuary. It was filled with books, stacked in neat towers on the floor and crammed into shelves. A few resilient green plants sat on the windowsill, soaking up the last of the evening sun. There was no loud noise here, no one demanding anything from her. There was just peace. She would make a simple dinner, eat it slowly, and then settle into her favorite worn-out armchair with her laptop. This was the moment the day truly began for her. As the screen glowed to life, illuminating her face, a change would come over her. Her posture, which was slightly hunched at the office, would straighten. Her shoulders would relax. Her fingers, which often fidgeted nervously in her lap during meetings, would rest on the keyboard, poised and confident. She opened a blank document. The cursor blinked at her, a tiny, steady heartbeat in the quiet room. And then her fingers began to move. They didn't just type, they danced. They flew across the keys with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for the quiet woman from the office. Words appeared on the screen, sharp, funny, and incredibly insightful. She was the Urban Scribe, an anonymous blogger with a devoted following. Her blog was a collection of observations about city life, but it was so much more than that. She wrote about the loneliness of being surrounded by people, the small acts of kindness you see on a crowded subway, the way the city changes its mood with the weather. Her readers felt like she understood them, like she was giving a voice to the thoughts they all had but could never articulate. Tonight, she was writing about office culture. She typed, "We are taught that a good idea is a loud idea. We mistake volume for value. We build rooms where the quietest voices are the ones most often ignored. And then we wonder why we end up with strategies that are all shell and no substance. The most valuable insights don't always come from a megaphone. Sometimes they come from a whisper in the corner, if only we would lean in close enough to hear." She paused, reading over the words. A small, satisfied smile touched her lips. Here, in this quiet room, her voice wasn't just heard. It was celebrated. It was powerful. Thousands of people would read this tomorrow. They would nod in agreement, share it with their friends, and leave comments calling her a genius. They had no idea that the brilliant urban scribe was the same woman they walked past every day without a second glance. The quiet woman in the corner whose fingers had finally found a way to speak for her. The news arrived on a Tuesday, a day that usually smelled of stale coffee and quiet desperation. But this Tuesday was different. An email landed in everyone's inbox with a subject line that screamed in all caps, "We got IT." The office, which was usually a low hum of individual concentration, erupted. It was like someone had set off a confetti bomb made of pure adrenaline. People were high-fiving, hugging, and letting out whoops of joy that made the cheap fluorescent lights seem to vibrate. Mark stood up on his chair, a move he'd probably seen in a movie, and raised his hands for silence. It took a moment, but the noise gradually died down, replaced by expectant faces. "Team, we did it!" he boomed, his voice filled with a pride that suggested he had single-handedly won the war. "The Sterling Development account. They're the biggest name in luxury real estate in the city. This isn't just a project, people. This is a statement. This is us telling the world we are the best." A cheer went up. Ilara, at her desk in the corner, watched the scene unfold. She felt a small, tight knot form in her stomach. A big account like this meant more work, more pressure, and more of Mark's voice echoing in her ears. She saw the dreams of big bonuses and promotions in her colleagues' eyes. She just saw late nights and a mountain of administrative work that would inevitably fall on her. She gave a small, polite clap when everyone else did, but her heart wasn't in it. She was already thinking about the logistics, the extra supplies they'd need, the scheduling nightmares to come. The first few weeks were a blur of activity. Mark called meeting after meeting, each one more energetic than the last. He'd whiteboard ideas that were all flash and no substance. "We need to sell a dream," he'd declare, drawing a picture of a skyscraper that looked suspiciously like a rocket ship. "We're not selling apartments. We're selling a lifestyle. Think champagne, think designer clothes, think fast cars." His team lapped it up. They were building a campaign around a fictional couple, a man and a woman who looked like they'd stepped straight out of a magazine. They were always laughing, always clinking champagne flutes on a balcony overlooking the city lights. The slogans were all about exclusivity and unparalleled luxury. It was shiny, it was pretty, and to Ilara, it felt completely hollow. She had been doing her own research, of course. It was part of her job to gather background data, but she went deeper. She read every article she could find about modern luxury trends. This research dovetailed perfectly with what she was writing for her blog, The Urban Scribe. Her last post, which had gotten a lot of attention, was about how the definition of luxury was changing. It wasn't about showing off wealth anymore. It was about time, space, and authenticity. It was about having a quiet place to read a book, a balcony where you could grow your own herbs, a building with a real community where you knew your neighbors. True luxury was peace, not a party. She saw the chasm between Mark's vision and what people actually wanted. It was a huge, gaping hole, and she felt like she was the only one standing on the edge, looking down into it. The unease in her stomach grew heavier with every meeting. She saw the team pouring their hearts into this flawed concept, and she felt a responsibility to say something. The opportunity came during a critical brainstorming session. They were finalizing the visuals for the first big presentation to the client. The screen was filled with images of the impossibly perfect couple, the woman dripping in diamonds, the man in a tuxedo even at breakfast. "Okay, people, this is gold," Mark said, beaming. "This is what they want to see. This is aspiration." The room was filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. Ilara took a deep breath. Her heart was thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She raised her hand, a small, uncertain gesture in the sea of confidence. Mark saw her. "Yes, Ilara? Do you need another notepad?" A few people snickered. Ilara felt her face get hot, but she pushed forward. "No, I had a thought." Her voice came out quieter than she wanted, but she kept going. "I was just thinking, maybe this isn't what people looking for a home want? I've been reading a lot, and it seems like the new idea of luxury is more real. It's about community, a place to feel safe and connected. Maybe we could show a family having a picnic in the park next to the building, or an older couple enjoying the morning sun on their patio." She finished, her voice trailing off. The room was silent for a moment. Mark looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and amusement. He let the silence hang in the air just long enough for it to become uncomfortable. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh. "Ilara, that's sweet, really. It's a nice thought for a cereal commercial, maybe. But this is sterling development. They don't sell nice. They sell wow. They sell a dream that's bigger than real life. We need to think bigger, not smaller. Leave the strategy to the people who understand the brand." He turned back to the screen, completely dismissing her. "All right, where were we?" "More champagne. Let's get some bubbles in that shot." The team immediately jumped back into the fray, their energy renewed. No one looked at Ilara. It was as if she had never spoken. The words hung in the air around her, each one a tiny sting. "Sweet, smaller, leave the strategy to us." She slowly lowered her hand and picked up her pen. She wrote down the date at the top of a fresh page in her notepad and then stared at the blank lines below. The familiar, heavy sigh settled deep inside her chest. She had tried. She had put her hand up and spoken, and it had changed nothing. The world was still full of shouters, and her voice was still just a whisper. In the days that followed, a strange sense of detachment came over her. She watched her colleagues work with a kind of frantic joy, building this glittering, hollow world on their computers. They ordered inexpensive lunches and worked late, the office glowing late into the night. She did her work efficiently and quietly, but her mind was elsewhere. She was an observer, a ghost in her own life. At lunch, she started taking walks. She'd leave the building and just wander through the surrounding streets. She saw the real city. She saw construction workers taking a break, sharing a thermos of coffee. She saw young mothers pushing strollers, talking tiredly but happily to each other. She saw an old man feeding pigeons on a park bench, a look of perfect contentment on his face. This was the real world. This was what people cared about. Not champagne flutes on a balcony. She felt a surge of certainty, so strong it was almost calming. She knew with every fiber of her being that Mark's campaign was going to fail. Back in the office, the team was putting the finishing touches on their masterpiece. They were so proud. They'd created a video, a slick, 2-minute masterpiece with a soaring orchestral score. It ended with the perfect couple toasting the camera as the sun set over their fictional city. Mark played it one last time for the whole team. "There it is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's a winner." Everyone clapped. Ilara clapped too, a soft, rhythmic sound that no one could hear over the noise. She looked at the screen, at the beautiful, empty people living their beautiful, empty life. They were building a beautiful ship, she thought, and they were all so busy admiring the polish on the deck that she was the only one who could see the iceberg waiting silently, just beneath the surface. The email arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, slicing through the office's nervous energy like a sharp knife. For weeks, the team had been living in a state of excited anticipation, riding the high of their big presentation. They'd patted each other on the back, congratulating themselves on the brilliance of their campaign. The initial silence from the client, Sterling Development, was explained away by Mark. "They're big players," he'd said, pacing around the office. "These things take time. They're probably just blown away by our genius." But this email wasn't a sign of them being blown away. It was a short, brutally direct message from the head of marketing at Sterling. It requested an emergency video call for the next morning to discuss the future of the campaign. The tone was cold, formal, and left no room for interpretation. The excited buzz in the office died instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. People stopped typing. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Mark read the email on his large monitor, his face slowly losing its color. He printed it out, read it again, and then crumpled it into a tight ball, tossing it into the wastebasket with a force that made a loud thud. The next morning's call was a disaster. The Sterling executives were polite but firm. They didn't mince words. The campaign, they said, was vapid, out of touch, and a complete misunderstanding of our brand and our clients. One of them, a woman with a steely expression, said, "You've sold us a fantasy from a decade ago. Our buyers aren't interested in champagne and tuxedos. They're interested in community, sustainability, and a sense of belonging. This feels hollow." When the call ended, the screen went black, and for a full minute no one in the conference room spoke. Mark was staring at the blank screen, his jaw tight. The team members looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. This wasn't just a failed campaign. It was a public humiliation. The biggest account the firm had ever landed was on the verge of walking away, and it was all their fault. Panic set in like a fever. The office, once a place of loud confidence, became a frantic, desperate hive. The days stretched into late nights. The glow of computer monitors replaced the setting sun as the team worked tirelessly, fueled by cold pizza and stale coffee. They tried to fix it, but they didn't know how. They were like mechanics trying to fix a car's engine by just polishing the hood. They changed the music in the ad, swapping the soaring orchestra for a cool, modern track. They replaced the male model with someone who looked a bit more approachable. They tweaked the slogan, adding a word about lifestyle. But the core problem, the fundamental hollowness that Ilara had tried to warn them about, remained. Mark became a shadow of his former self. The charismatic leader was gone, replaced by a stressed, irritable man who paced the office like a caged animal. He snapped at people, his frustration boiling over at the slightest mistake. No, that's not it. Think, people. We need to think. He'd shout, but thinking was exactly what they weren't doing. They were just reacting, thrashing around in the dark, hoping to accidentally bump into a solution. Through it all, Ilara remained a quiet observer. She stayed late, not because she was asked to, but because it felt wrong to leave them alone in their misery. She'd make a fresh pot of coffee, organize the chaotic mess of papers that accumulated on the central table, and tidy up the discarded food containers. She did her work, the administrative tasks that kept the office functioning, but she watched everything. She saw the fear in her colleagues' eyes. She saw the desperation in Mark's. A part of her, a small, uncharitable part, wanted to say, "I told you so." But a larger part of her felt a pang of sympathy. They were like sailors who had ignored the lighthouse and were now crashing against the rocks. She knew exactly how to save them, but she also knew they weren't ready to listen to her. Not yet. About a week into the crisis, a young man who had recently joined the team was tasked with a last-ditch effort, find some external inspiration. Mark had thrown up his hands. Just find something, anything. Look at what other industries are doing. Look at what artists are doing. I don't care, just find a new angle. The young man, feeling the weight of the task, spent hours online. He scrolled through countless marketing blogs, competitor websites, and design portfolios. Nothing clicked. It was all more of the same, flashy images, empty promises. Defeated, he leaned back in his chair and typed a simple, honest question into a search engine. What does luxury mean to people today? Among the top results was a link to a blog called The Urban Scribe. He'd heard of it, a lot of people had. It was known for its sharp, insightful writing about city life. He clicked on the link. The first article he saw was titled, "The Quiet Revolution, Why the New Luxury is Less." He started to read. The words seemed to jump off the screen. "We are drowning in noise," the article began. "The modern world shouts at us, telling us that more is better, that louder is more important, that a life worth living is a life worth displaying. But a quiet revolution is happening. People are starting to realize that true luxury isn't about what you can show off, but what you can feel. It's not a gold watch. It's the time to not need a watch. It's not a penthouse apartment overlooking a loud city. It's a quiet balcony where you can hear the birds. It's not about being seen in the right places. It's about feeling at home in your own space." The young man's eyes widened. He read faster, his heart beating a little quicker. The brands that will win in the coming decade are not the ones that sell a dream, but the ones that sell a reality. A better reality. They sell connection, not isolation. They sell peace, not chaos. They sell a sense of belonging, not exclusivity. The old marketing is a megaphone. The new marketing is a conversation. He couldn't believe what he was reading. It was as if the writer had been sitting in their meetings, had seen their failed campaign, and was now explaining with perfect clarity exactly why it had failed. "Hey," he called out, his voice a little shaky. "You guys need to come see this." One by one, his tired colleagues drifted over. Soon, a small crowd was gathered around his monitor, their faces illuminated by the glow of the screen. They read over his shoulder, their expressions slowly changing from exhaustion to dawning understanding. Mark, drawn by the commotion, pushed his way through the group. "What is it? What did you find?" The young man just pointed to the screen. Mark leaned in, squinting. He read the article, his lips moving silently. When he finished, he straightened up and ran a hand through his already messy hair. He looked at the screen, then at his team, a look of pure awe on his face. "My God," he muttered, his voice filled with a mix of wonder and desperation. This person is a genius. They understand it completely. This is exactly what Sterling is talking about. This is the answer." He looked around at his team, his eyes wild with a new, frantic hope. "Who is this urban scribe?" "Find out. I don't care what it costs. If only we could hire them." Across the room, sitting at her desk, quietly organizing a stack of file folders, Ilara heard every word. She heard the praise for her writing, the awe in their voices, The desperate plea from the man who had dismissed her so completely. A strange and powerful mix of emotions washed over her. There was a surge of pride, a warm, satisfying feeling that her ideas, her voice, were finally being recognized as valuable. But tangled up with that pride was a thick, heavy rope of frustration. They were praising a ghost, an anonymous name on a screen. The real person, the one who had sat in their meetings and tried to tell them the very same things, was still invisible. She looked down at her hands, the ones that had typed those words they now called genius. Her fingers had spoken for her, loud and clear, but she herself had never been more quiet. The discovery of the urban scribe injected a powerful dose of adrenaline into the tired office. For a few hours, it was like the crisis had never happened. The team was buzzing with a new kind of energy, a focused, desperate hope. Mark was like a man who had found a map to buried treasure. He had the blog projected onto the main screen, and he paced back and forth in front of it, reading passages out loud. "Listen to this," he'd say, pointing a finger at the screen. "True connection isn't found in a crowd. It's found in a shared glance across a quiet room. That's it. That's the feeling we need to capture." He turned to his team, his eyes wild with inspiration. "Okay, new plan. We model everything on this. This is our Bible now." The young man who had found the blog was suddenly a hero. People kept coming over to his desk, asking him questions, patting him on the back. The office was a flurry of activity. They were trying to reverse engineer the scribe's philosophy, to apply its wisdom to their failing campaign. But it was like trying to bake a cake with only a picture of the finished product. They had the end result, but they didn't have the recipe, the ingredients, or the no-how. Mark's single quote's first priority was to find the writer. He tasked 2 people with scouring the internet for any clue. Check the website's registry. Look for digital footprints. See if they've commented on other blogs under the same name. I don't care how you do it, find out who this person is. But the search was a dead end. The urban scribe was a ghost. The blog was hosted on a platform that guaranteed user anonymity. There was no About Me page, no contact form, no links to social media profiles. It was just pure, unadulterated text appearing on a schedule like clockwork every Tuesday and Friday. The writer was meticulous, careful, and seemingly uninterested in fame or recognition. This only made Mark want to hire them more. A pure talent, he muttered to himself, staring at the screen, unspoiled by the industry. As the day wore on, the initial excitement began to curdle into frustration. They had the philosophy, but they couldn't translate it into a concrete plan. They'd gather in the conference room, the blog's words glowing on the screen, and try to brainstorm. But their ideas were still clumsy, still rooted in their old way of thinking. Someone would suggest, "Okay, so, community, let's show a picture of a bunch of people smiling in the lobby." Mark would shake his head. "No, the scribe said it's not about a crowd. It's about a quiet connection." It was an agonizing, paradoxical loop. They knew what they were doing wrong, but they didn't know how to do it right. The pressure was mounting. The client had given them 1 week to come back with a completely new direction. 1 week. That gave them only 4 more days. The atmosphere in the office grew tense again. The renewed energy was gone, replaced by a thick, heavy anxiety. They had the answer right in front of them, but it was locked behind a wall of anonymity. Across the room, Ilara watched the drama unfold. She felt like a scientist observing an experiment in which she was the secret, active ingredient. Every time they praised the blog, a warm wave of pride washed over her. They were her words, her thoughts, her voice. But the feeling was always followed by a cold, sharp pang of irony. They were worshipping a ghost while ignoring the living, breathing person sitting just a few feet away. She saw Mark's frustration, the desperation in his eyes as he tried and failed to replicate her style. She saw her colleagues, their faces etched with exhaustion and confusion. They were good people, she thought. They were just stuck in a system that rewarded loudness over substance. A part of her was tempted to just let them fail. It would serve Mark right for his arrogance. It would be a satisfying, if bitter, form of justice. But as she looked at their tired faces, she couldn't bring herself to do it. They were all in this together. The failure of the campaign would affect everyone, not just Mark. Her problem wasn't with them. It was with the culture that had taught them to dismiss the quiet. And maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to change that culture, not from behind a keyboard, but from right here. In this room, the thought terrified her. Her comfort zone was the glowing screen of her laptop, the familiar feel of the keys under her fingers. Speaking up in a room full of people, especially now, with all eyes desperate for a solution, was her worst nightmare. Her voice would shake. Her words would get tangled. They wouldn't listen. They never listened, but then she looked at her hands. She thought about how they moved when she wrote, how the thoughts flowed from her mind, through her fingertips and onto the screen. Her fingers didn't get nervous. Her fingers didn't mumble or get interrupted. Her fingers knew exactly what to say. The idea that began to form in her mind was crazy, reckless, and the only thing she could think of that might actually work. On the fourth day, the team hit a wall. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The client presentation was the next morning. Mark called an emergency meeting. Everyone shuffled into the conference room, their faces grim. They had nothing. A few half-baked ideas were scribbled on the whiteboard, but they all looked lifeless and pathetic. Mark stood at the head of the table, his shoulders slumped. He looked defeated. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice quiet. For the first time, he wasn't a charismatic leader. He was just a man who was out of ideas. "We have the philosophy. We know what the client wants. But we can't build it. It's like we have the sheet music, but we don't know how to play the music." He walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. He stared at the blank space, then wrote a single word, community. He underlined it. Then he wrote another, authenticity. He underlined that too. He stared at the words, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This isn't it," he said, shaking his head. "It's just words, it has no life." He put the cap back on the marker and tossed it onto the tray. He leaned his forehead against the cool surface of the whiteboard, a picture of total despair. The room was silent. No one knew what to say. They had failed, and then a sound broke the silence. The scrape of a chair. Everyone turned to look. It was Ilara. She was standing up. For a moment, everyone just stared, confused. She never stood up in meetings. She barely even looked up from her notepad. She walked toward the front of the room. Her steps were quiet but deliberate. She moved with a calm, steady purpose that was completely at odds with the frantic energy of the past few weeks. She walked past Mark, who was still leaning against the whiteboard, and stopped in front of it. She picked up the marker he had just discarded. Mark straightened up, watching her. The team members exchanged confused glances. What was she doing? Ilara didn't say a word. She just stood there for a second, looking at the two words Mark had written, community and authenticity. Then her hand began to move. She didn't erase his words. She drew a box around them. Then above the box she wrote a new headline. It wasn't flashy. It was simple, powerful, and direct. Your place in the city. Then her fingers began to fly. She didn't write in sentences. She wrote in concepts and keywords and short, impactful phrases. She drew lines connecting ideas. She sketched out a new campaign structure, one that was built around real stories. The couple who found each other in the building's book club. The retired teacher who now runs the rooftop garden. The kid who has a safe place to do his homework in the community lounge. Her writing was neat, precise, and incredibly fast. The same speed and grace her fingers had on her keyboard at night was now on full display for everyone to see. The concepts were brilliant, the strategy flawless, and the language was unmistakably the articulate, powerful voice of the urban scribe. The room fell into a state of stunned silence. Everyone was watching her, their mouths slightly open. They weren't just seeing a plan. They were watching a masterpiece being created in real time. The ideas were flowing from her fingertips, painting a picture of a campaign that was alive, that had a heart and a soul. Mark was the first to connect the dots. He had been staring at the blog for days. He knew the writer's style, the way they thought, the specific phrases they used. He looked from the brilliant living plan on the whiteboard to the quiet woman who was drawing it. He saw the way her fingers moved with such confidence, such authority. He looked at the phrase, "your place in the city," and remembered a line from the blog. Luxury isn't a place you show off. It's a place where you belong. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at her hands, then at her face, a face he had barely looked at in all the years she had worked there. And he knew. It couldn't be anyone else. The quiet woman in the corner, the one he had dismissed, the one whose ideas he had ignored. She was the urban scribe. The genius they had been desperately searching for was sitting in their office all along. The silence in the room was so complete. Ilara could hear the low hum of the projector and the faint, frantic beating of her own heart. Every eye was on her, but it was a different kind of attention than she was used to. It wasn't the brief, dismissive glance she got when she asked for a notepad. It was a deep, searching stare filled with a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, almost holy reverence. Her colleagues were looking at the whiteboard, then back at her as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. The pieces were there, but they couldn't quite make them fit. Mark was the one who finally broke the spell. He was still standing a few feet away, his face pale, his usual confident posture completely gone. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw not just the quiet administrative assistant, but the mind behind the words that had captivated him, the genius he had been desperately trying to find. The power dynamic in the room had done a complete somersault. His voice, when it came, was stripped of all its usual boom. It was quiet, almost hesitant. "Ilara," he started, then cleared his throat. "Explain this to us." It wasn't a command. It was a request. A plea. Ilara slowly turned to face the team, the marker still in her hand. She took a breath, and for the first time in a professional setting, she didn't feel the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was still there, a little flutter, but it was overpowered by a deep, steady certainty. She knew she was right. More importantly, they now knew she was right. She didn't speak loudly. Her voice was soft, clear, and carried a quiet authority that no one had ever heard from her before. "It's not about selling a building," she began, her eyes moving from face to face. "It's about selling a life within the building." The old campaign was about a fantasy. This one is about a reality. A better reality. She pointed to the first box she had drawn. This couple meeting in the book club. That's not just a stock photo. That's a story. It's about connection. It tells a potential buyer that they won't just be buying an apartment. They'll be finding a community. They'll find friends. She moved to the next sketch. The retired teacher and the rooftop garden. That's not about luxury amenities. That's about purpose. It tells the buyer that this is a place where you can continue to grow, to contribute, to feel useful, no matter your age. It's about having a piece of the earth to call your own in the middle of a concrete city. As she spoke, the team leaned in closer. The young man who had found her blog was the first to break his silence. "So the tagline, 'Your place in the city,' it's not just about a physical place. It's about your place in the city. Your role, your connection." Ilara nodded, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "Exactly. It's psychological. It's about belonging." The floodgates opened. The team, no longer frantic but energized, began to build on her ideas. The woman with the perfect manicure who had always focused on visuals suggested a photo style that was warm and candid, not slick and staged. The intern, who had been so nervous, pointed out that they could feature real community groups from the city in the campaign. They weren't just taking orders anymore. They were collaborating, inspired by the framework she had built. Mark didn't pace or shout. He sat down at the table, just another member of the team, listening, nodding, and occasionally asking a thoughtful question. The office that night didn't feel like a pressure cooker. It felt like a workshop filled with a creative, collaborative energy that Ilara had only ever dreamed of, the presentation too. Sterling Development the next morning was the final test. The conference room at their office was intimidating, all glass and chrome, with a view of the city that made you feel small. The executives from Sterling sat on one side of the table, their expressions polite but unreadable. Mark started the meeting, but he was different. He was humble. He didn't take any of the credit. "We had a breakthrough," he said simply. "And my colleague is going to walk you through a new vision. A vision that we believe is true to your brand and true to the people you want to reach." Then he nodded to Alara, and he sat down. This was it. Her moment. She felt a tremor of fear, but she took a breath and remembered the feeling of her fingers flying across the whiteboard. She walked to the front, not as a quiet assistant, but as an expert. She didn't have a loud, booming voice or flashy slides. She just had the truth of her ideas. She spoke about the quiet revolution, about the search for authenticity and connection. She presented the concepts she had drawn, not as a marketing strategy, but as a series of human stories. She was calm, thoughtful, and every word was chosen with care. She wasn't performing. She was explaining. At first, the executives were silent, just as her colleagues had been. But then, the woman with the steely expression from the last video call began to nod. Slowly at first, then more firmly. When Alara finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the woman spoke. "This," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that hadn't been there before, "is exactly what we've been trying to say. You didn't just listen to our feedback. You understood it. You understood us." The campaign was a resounding success. It saved the account and earned the firm praise for its insight and humanity. But the real change happened inside their own office walls. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic shifted completely. Ilara was still a quiet person, but she was no longer invisible. Her desk was moved from the corner to a more central spot, though she kept the large fake plant nearby, a small reminder of where she came from. Mark now began every brainstorming session by turning to her and asking, "Ilara, what are your thoughts?" And he would actually wait to hear the answer. Her colleagues started coming to her for advice, not just for administrative tasks. They valued her opinion. They saw the person behind the quiet exterior. She even started her own blog, revealing her identity as the urban scribe in a final post titled, "Finding My Voice." The response was overwhelming. One afternoon, a new project came in. The team gathered in the conference room, the whiteboard clean and ready. Mark stood at the head, a marker in his hand. He looked at the team, his eyes finding Alara's. He tossed her the marker. She caught it effortlessly. "Okay," he said with a smile. "Show us what you've got." The quiet woman was no longer dismissed. She had found her voice, but everyone now knew it had been speaking all along, eloquently and powerfully, through the incredible work of her fingers.